Confederates' wizard communism perpetually generates situations such as the COVID Fauci scenario, where Fauci, being presented as the science, is generated as the superior entity that cannot be challenged or analyzed, generating the compulsion into compliance in the totalitarian arrangement of the Druid systems. At which point you have the system of the virus, which was created as a bioweapon according to the estimates. And Obama, having rejected it, moved to China in order to continue the weapons research, which serves at the larger agenda of using the bioweapon against the general public in order to justify predetermined plans concerning the upgrade in policy in the suppression of the general public into the totalitarian wizard communist system of the KKK, or Wizard Communist Confederacy. At which point you have these systems of systematically conducting the destruction of the United States economy as attacked by Lindsey Graham's wizard communism in his position of using the government against civilians as the function of winning wars. And war against civilians is always a war crime, and all damages against the civilians would be defined as a war crime, including the intentional misrepresentation of facts, including the use of the changed facts in order to not respect legal obligations, such as in the Bill of Rights, or the functionality of a war criminal having the right to have their status protected. And with the reduction of status, you have the reduction of qualifier obligations, such as human decency, which is the subject, such as living conditions for food and life, including the definition of human decency as a subordinate necessary aspect of it, is no longer life without the human decency from the status being reduced from, making it a violation of the right to life in order to acquire their criminal agendas, and the coercions and oppressions generated on this behalf, such as the KKK terrorism insurrection against the civilians, such as the destruction of property, such as the tampering with of items such as their vehicles or tools or ability to work, or their heaters or their water or the sewage, or base things that everyone needs to be able to do, including the functionality of reducing the aristocracy, such as David's character, into the suppressed state beyond the position of the normal position of what do you call it? Wars of attrition, in order to exhaust them exponentially. You have the reduction of the living conditions themselves beyond the position of just sanitary, which is an active aspect of their war crimes, but the existence of the reduction of the status itself, such as the breach of the freedom of association by the act of threats and coercions and poisons in order to coerce or dissuade people. Now, if you have a series of aggressions conducted against a target from a harassment campaign, and people observe the side effects of the harassment campaign, it would be observably understandable for it to be a subversion against the association, which otherwise would have worked normally, at which point it is beyond the non-violent use of government mechanisms into the criminal violence or war crime mechanism of the systems. And now, while normal society will gossip as it does, this is secondary to the intentional implementation of the persistent enforcement of the wizard isolation tactics. Now, with the criminal isolation in tow, you have the harassment campaigns against the targets, which serve as a mechanism of false harassment against predetermined false flag operations. And the false flag operation, approving of the terrorist attack, pretends to be made uncomfortable by the arrangement, while completely reinforcing and validating the operation having had happened, as an act of fraud engages in the subversion of the position, allowing for the weaponization of the harassment in general, uses the subject of the harassment as a financial political currency account holding system. And the more they exploit it for fraud, the more in debt the total system has, similar to the boy who cried wolf. Eventually, it goes bankrupt and people stop responding to it, which is the perpetual vulnerability, which is a plan of those who, the men who hate women in the white nationalist community conducted through the Druid system in the KKK, are doing with the Feminists Incorporated, who are perpetually generating the racket of false accusations that are known to be fraudulent by the women, who are actively collaborating with the system, which is depleting the securities and accounts of the political influence for the security of the rest of their political identity into the abject suppression and horrific conditions, which are the natural condition which had been subverted by the building of the political influence of their political identity. At which point you have the reduction back to its state of nature, as they are distracted with their various interests into the complete destruction of the identity back into the suffrage or various abuses that had historically been conducted in their political identity accounts, poverty, which is the status quo function of allowing the scenario of them being treated as a product, which allows for the sales and distribution of them and abuses against them on the black market, which is actively funding the criminal operations and wars, as all funding is off the charts. At which point you have the use of the money laundering, which is the cleaning of the money into contracts back into the general public, which is founded on the wizard communist central planning picking of winners and losers, which allows for the abusers' contracts to win under those arrangements, at which point the abusers getting paid the better contracts are actively celebrated, at which point you celebrate your abusers and you condemn and harass and harangue and outcast the victims, similar to they did with Jeffrey Epstein and his victims. They actively denigrated the victims as prostitutes and others and abused them and poisoned them, giving them STDs and other things in order to coerce compliance by their isolation tactics and their general suppression techniques, which generates the use of the entire force of the intelligence agencies against those guilty of nothing except being victims. At which point you have the utter condemnation of the victim in celebration of the abuser, which is very interesting to study in depth, such as its active involvement in the intelligence community, as well as its overbranches into the military and locals and etc. At which point you have an active system of people using unitary executive theory type strategies in order to justify their position, including the sheriff that ordered a minor to have sex with him because he was a sheriff and thus had the authority of kings, at which point their compulsion to abject dominance over the position includes their systems which are actively hypocritical as a resource of their value. Now, the use in economics of a product being valuable is based upon, number one, sales and difficulty to produce, including getting it from factory to the distributor to the customer. Now, the more dangers you put in the way, the more expensive the product, at which point the more they want to do a particular crime, the more aggressive they'll be against it in order to ram up the cost. And since they have the permits structure for the permission to conduct the crimes, they aren't going to be caught in any substantive punishable way. making it de facto legal for them in a two-tiered structure. The Druid supporters, the Communist Confederate supporters, having full immunity to the subject, have no actual worries about this issue, at which point the more aggressive they are against the general public on the subject, the more they charge, the more dark money they generate, at which point the subject of the regression is the basis of how much they actually support its existence and distribution. Thus, the more malicious they are in the oppression of their opponents, the more they actually support it. Similar to the function of the CIA having been caught, as was quoted by Steven Crowder a while ago, when they were caught with child porn trying to frame people. They were using victims as a VPN type substitute in order to conduct their entertainments while conducting their missions, and they wanted to punish that internally, which under the original state of law would have meant David's branch of the military as intelligence oversight. They would be the ones arresting them for the criminal exchange, and with that understanding, they had actively attacked the branch of the military to obscure it in order to subvert its ability to restrain them under checks and balances, which generates the ability to engage in their criminal operations, asserting the position similar to the Secrets of the Secret Service book, which cites many crimes which are actively validated, as the Secret Service isn't allowed to pay its employees more. It provides superior status, such as their ability to get away with things, and the ability to get away with things has led to the nonchalant absolute rejection of the rule of law in favor of the arbitrary enforcement of their will, such as the time that they actively went to a crime scene or otherwise blind drunk getting in an accident, and the Secret Service actively had to cover for them. So you have the use of these criminal markets as a status symbol, which is actively traded as a substitute for American dollars, which is the use of actively distributing the black market and crime market as the last exploitable resource before the complete collapse of the society into the factions of the feudalist structure, turning everything from the federal systems into the hyper-local factions, which generates the complete shattering of the United States as a collective community into its arbitrary super-local communities after the Confederacy has already invested in taking over the super-specific areas, at which point you have the systems of being ruled by local wizards under that specific faction, at which point you have the larger factions which collect these smaller factions, which generate their ability to conduct their various insurgent nation loyalty, such as the communists or the feudalist Nazis, etc., which is basically any outside enemy nation, hostile nation, which has infiltrated the United States government, protecting itself by the secrets as a parasite blocking the autoimmune system. At which point you have the mechanisms which are perpetuating themselves by the aggression against the thing that they are actively needing to exist as a resource, perpetuating the permanence of the crime, and thus with the Trojan horse you have no ability to solve the problems. Thus you can't solve a drug war, you can't solve prohibition with alcohol, you can't solve any black market issue, because the agreement is that they have to have it as the alternative payment. At which point the systems actively take over the various structures, such as the ramming up of the lawless anarcho-terrorist forces, such as the mechanism of creating gang systems within inside the localized police forces, which are supposed to be the ensured collapsed factions, which would be under the larger communist structure. The larger system, having complete control over them, can allow it to shatter into its fractions as long as it is subordinate to the Confederate wizard structure, at which point the system is merely loyalty to the secret system. Now, when the arrest of a particular criminal comes in, such as, helter skelter, you have sheriffs who arrest them and are told to let them go because it's above your pay grade. Now, the statement itself that it's above your pay grade is the acknowledgement that they're operating under the system of wizard loyalties or to the secrecy loyalties, at which point the feudalist structure, which would have normally been kings, becomes wizard kings, which is infinitely difficult and obscured in order to realize, as the mechanism itself is intentionally an illusion. It is the vast majority of the time misdirection, at which point there is no real way in order to stop the system. Now, in 1983, the Confederacy, advancing their terrorism, went from the FBI Nazis seeking the insurrection, which was stopped by the military, into infecting the military, which began to conduct policies of purposeless abuse against the general public, at which point they would go on arbitrary torture campaigns, violating basic rights such as the right to be secure in your person, your papers, and your effects, as the resource on the black market of abuse, and the satisfaction of being able to conduct the sadist abuse itself is to be satisfied by the release in the criminal market, at which point the targets against the general community become abused in order to relieve the excess value owed to them under their own estimate, asserting their status by the consistent maintenance of these abuses or the use of the criminal products, which allows for the assertion of their loyalty to the magic system. Now, while the Americans can conduct an aggression against them with punishments, that serves as the mutual bonding system of if you go down, we're all going down type mentality, whereas it evolves simply into the assertion of status, of dominance superior to law, in contempt of the laws of nature, in the superiority as they systematically dismantle the American rule of law and order, generating the racist structure from the KKK, operating the black market, which is exponentially going to be increased through the structure of its phantom cells, which, acting independent to each other and ignorant of each other, are actively collaborating with the concept of each other in the larger missions, as the hyper-specific mission is exclusive to itself, but when the other operations come around, then they actively collaborate under the structure of those who are observing the larger strategy and watching as it comes into place, at which point you have the exponential compounding interests of those who are systematically agreeing to something that looks benign but culminates with the collection of the compounded interest into the realization of catastrophic damages, such as the normalization of a family wanting to control the sexual habits of their daughters. Now, their sexual habits of their daughters being under the control could seem rather difficult for them to control by themselves, and so it would seem an easy tendency to let a broader community, say like the feminist position under communism, for the community to take over the family affairs, at which point you default from the localized family into the community or government, forming an alternative government. Now, the government not specifically legally being involved with the subject is not relevant to the issue of its perpetual enforcement of the phantom cell. Now, these series of choices leads to the communist position of choosing winners and losers, suppressing and repulsing and harassing and defaming and separating peoples is the barrier of the freedom of association. And with the criminal use of subversions in order to create the separation of associations, you have the system which allows them to control the sexual market opportunities, which is the opportunity to pick winners and losers in the market itself, generating the natural conclusion of the rape culture itself, collectively certifying the permits of sexual opportunities, which, if it violates the position of the person's will, which it is by de facto always done by that definition, unless they're kind of Confederate wife creep who wants the community to pick their relationships, then they, by definition, did not consent to it, making it a criminal action of the government, forming an enforced rape culture by the use of these criminal subversions, by communitizing a super specific family affair. And having evolved from the family affair, the phantom cell expands into the larger community, allowing it to be traded on its brokerage network, which was justified in order to relieve the pressure on the parents and the control over their children. At which point you have these oppressive systems generating the total market opportunities for everyone beyond the families that consented, and this general enforcement systematically becomes exponentially more difficult to break down the larger it expands, at which point it exceeds past the power of that local community's faction into the larger magic structure, which is a thing that they're actively reproducing from the classic Druid system, which could ignore local factional kings in favor of the loyalty to the Druid religion, which allows them, under their loyalty to magic networks themselves, to engage in these systematic oppressions at a larger national level or international level, which is actively being invested into by the larger structures from the World Economic Forum and others, which are using surveillance powers, which are able to actively manipulate people's bodies and minds into the position of the advance of the sin of sorcery. Now, sorcery is considered pharmakia. Now, pharmakia is mind-altering drugs, and the use of equipment in order to engage in mind-altering operations in order to pass fraudulent exchanges allows for the permanent maintenance of unlimited injuries, as the position is founded on the criminal advancement of the criminal market. The evil exponentially compounds on itself as a profitable enterprise in and of itself, at which point the investment into the function of crime, being its own interest, becomes the functional religion, as that becomes the most fundamental aspect of their society. At the top, conducting the wizard decisions, is the sales and distributing and comparison of status on the basis of their debts to society by the use of their exchanges on the crime market, which is not relieved to the general public or the chattel public, which has to still be subject to the criminalization of the product in the two-tiered system, so that they can control the pricing at the very top, as their central planning of their crime markets is fundamental to the majority of their returns as they exponentially increase in their technologies and the centralizing ingestion of their returns in education in order to produce their upgrades. It becomes untenable under the normal acceleration, but is the acceptance of the expiration date becomes acceptable in favor of them satisfying their arbitrary evils and lusts, which is cited in Revelation, which, despite all of the abuses against the world and all of the punishments against the world, against every heinous thing that could possibly be done to them, even then they refused to repent, as was compounded by the use of the mark of the beast, which is the functional sorcery, which they would have figured out how to have removed the human soul, at which point the permanent state of abject misery in that system is still at its core the loyalty to the opposition to the laws of nature and nature's God, at which point they're not having a soul by their discovery of consciousness base code generates their ability to invest exclusively in evil as its core loyalty or service. Now, the loyalty to arbitrary evil means, by definition, they have wizard agreements, which are separate to their political obligations, which generates the collapse of the general society in favor of their specific interests in their individual greeds, such as the mutual plan to collapse Social Security, which, having been developed as a Ponzi scheme, was never going to be sustainable under its original rules, which is irrelevant according to their estimate, because that, amongst many other infinite variations of interest, is something that their character for David would have solved by the purchase of the federal social programs. He would have fixed the trust issues, correcting all of the intentional mistakes that they had put into it, nullifying their need from their fraud in order to collapse it as a structure. Now, their position is they never wanted to do the Social Security, and the reason for their permission to Social Security and other social programs is the selling of war bonds at the top. Now, they engage in the Ponzi scheme, which gets them there, and then they engage in their war on terror, and then they take their exponential amounts of war bonds out, and then they've depleted the thing, at which point it becomes too expensive in order to maintain for an extended period of time, at which point their goal becomes exhausting it, as it has always meant to be fraudulent. The stability that led up to that point is purely illusionary, as the connection to the time of the War on Terror was specifically timed in order to take out the capped amount of its potential returns under their overarching strategies, at which point it had to be taken out by the war bonds. So the War on Terror had to happen. 9/11 therefore had to happen. Therefore, David had to be removed, because David, having air security of 9/11, would not have listened to Mattis's order to turn off the air security, which would have defeated the plane attacks against the trade towers, which would have allowed them to remain in the sky, defeating the entire presumption of the War on Terror. Without that, you have the complete subversion of the plan, which has led to many of their agreements, such as Joe Biden's agreement to collapse Social Security, as a collective wizard agreement, which generates their position of the systematic dismantlement of the United States government in their larger overthrow of the Republic by their Confederate insurrections, by insurgent terrorists from the KKK, which is wizard militia, which are infiltrating the United States government for the advantages referred to in the larger dismantlement of the Western world and collective order in favor of the one world revelation government. You also have many of the other issues, such as the Twitter files, which had been a long-standing plan as well, as most of their plans are over the use of 40 or 70 years, exponentially protected under the phantom cells structures, protecting the specific missions under high secrecy mechanisms, generating their results to culmination over the predetermined planned amount of time. The attacks against David's structure subverts his network's development of his Silicon Valley type systems, such as his computer structures, such as his website structures, such as his social media structures, etc., which, as intelligence oversight, is not subject to intelligence, led to their sedition against the intelligence oversight and the destruction of his branch of the military, so that they can continue without disruption the takeover of the social media under the Project Mockingbird type arrangements, which is the capture of the news, and thus the social media being an extension of the news was an inevitability, at which point the corporate capture is actually Confederate capture, and Confederate capture is KKK wizard terrorists, and the censorship generated by those orders are specifically an attack against the American Republic. Thus, their use of secrecies not being able to be confessed to under any circumstance, including public interest, is a specific attack not just against the public interest, but the existence of the government itself. And thus, their attack against the government is the core issue more than the public interest being fundamental to the forming of a popular government would be the foundation of the republic, and thus the constitutional republic needs that function as well, but they are specifically separate strategic assaults, at which point you have these systems of perpetually ignoring the systems of the republic and its general authorities, such as the position that the executive can ignore an order from the judiciary, or the ignoring of the legislator or the coercing of the legislator, as the systematic increase of the black money systems decreases the power of the purse from Congress, which is its influence over the executive powers, which become increasingly contemptuous of the authority of Congress, at which point its oversight becomes more and more meaningless excessively over time, as it removes itself from the authority of the American government under the public chosen Congress and legislator in general. At which point the Congress being vulnerable or accountable to the American public is ignored in favor of the executive, which is not accountable to the public, which is the active coup, at which point the executive, not having any accountability mechanisms to the public, is completely ignoring them, at which point you have the system of replacing executives, which does not exist because of the removal of David's branch of the military, such as the arresting of insurrectionists by double agents, at which point the dealing with problems inside the intelligence community would be the purpose of David's branch, which includes the Confederate insurrection. At which point you have the executive, which is ignoring the legislative, which is vulnerable to the American public, which requires David's branch in order to exist, in order to restrain the actual offenders and not punish the non-offenders, as the legislator do not have a mechanism of authority to actually make the executive behave legally according to the order, at which point you have the entire clusterfuck of the insurrection, at which point insurgent terrorist is a criminal aspect, which they're using the position of them being an insurgent in order to protect themselves from punishments of their general crimes, which is a criminal subversion, and as their specific class is acknowledged as a criminal exchange, the fact that they were able to successfully become an insurgent to do terrorism should not be an argument in order to protect them, as that is doublespeak by lunatics who are a danger to society. That danger to society actively engages in criminal political terrorism in order to engage in hate crimes of various forms under the normal operations of the black market, such as the false assumption of pre-crime convictions, such as through William Barr, which is actively reinforced at the local level by cooperators such as parents and people of various kinds who actively use the magic system, who do not want to forfeit the structure of the magic system and thus comply in subordination to the magic network, at which point the attack against the government itself becomes protected by the general public, who are using the magic system and covering for it and gaslighting for it in order to engage in the protection of their criminal enterprises from the thing that they would perceive as normal or acceptable, which is before the excesses of their larger criminal operations, such as the normalization of the protected permits for the crimes for those who are arbitrarily or indirectly connected to the magic system, such as the actively traded rape culture permit structure, which allows for rapists to get away with the rapes on the basis of the sales and distribution of a permit, which has legalized it as it has become an accepted, recognized, certified sale, at which point the Confederates' magic system only cares about the paperwork, at which point you have these systems which are known and not known as rape by the victims, who are perpetually vulnerable to those exchanges of their greater community, actively engaging in the use of violence for their malicious oppression and control over their bodies against their will, for the systematic celebration of those very same controls which are inherent to the state of nature in its arbitrary evils as a base attraction and addiction, at which point it is natural for a family to want those controls. It is natural for it to expand into the greater community, which will want those abuses. And in each stage, it will seem perfectly normal. And in each excess, it will seem an acceptable minority in order to continue the maintenance of that structure, which goes back into the larger federal magic structure, which is specifically dangerous to the existence of the government, which leads to the new subject of enemy combatant labeling, which, similar to the William Barr's unitary executive theory pre-crime convictions, generates the surveillance human trafficking systems of invasive technology for their assault and abuse by the use of military active denial systems, which have various specific techniques which they are able to advance, such as the FBI's ability to engage in coerced speech. Now, the electrocution of the person and the hacking of their nerves generates a natural reaction from the assault, which is predetermined as its ability to control the target being trafficked, at which point the enemy combatant system, similar to the victims of Jeffrey Epstein, become exponentially abused and exponentially defamed as the targets are actively being changed in their mental state so that they cannot represent themselves correctly to the general public, as they are in a permanent state of not being in control or intoxication of various forms by the sorcerer's technology. At which point you have these systems which are exponentially compounding on themselves, at which point those who are claiming positive functions of government in good faith, which are necessary PR representation, become more and more of the minority as the structure compels them to protect the interest of the criminal exchanges, taking more and more resources, requiring a higher conversion rate into the criminal aspects of the system. At which point the system exponentially collapses onto itself, similar to the Soviet Union under that structure, as it had hyper-accelerated its abuses through the ingestion of Jeffrey Sachs and George Soros's capitalist insurgency, which, having been imbued into the Soviet Union with the specific blocking of David's insurance structures, which would have saved them exponentially from the majority of their injuries, would have specifically satisfied them from their starvation campaigns generated by the exponential poverty created by the fraudulent market systems designed to collapse them, similar to the wizard communist consistent collapsing of the American economy by booms and busts in the general market or collapses of the general communities. It's said that there are two ways of destroying a community, and one is the use of bombs or war, and the other one is by price or price fixing on rent. At which point they have many of these technologies and techniques which they have honed over exponential periods of time in order to generate these controls of these market functions, at which point the collapse of the Soviet Union by the ingestion of the communist wizards generates the predetermined collapse inevitability, which required them to remove David as he is superior in function and faculty to them under the original estimate, at which point, without the obstructions at full strength, their injuries would have been benign or non-specifically noticeable beyond their conviction, at which point them being convicted or ordered to be arrested, etc., would have exponentially been the only real side effect of that campaign with David's insurance, according to the estimate, justifying their criminal use of violence against the infant. Now, the systems of graspings and settlings is the assertion of the normal cycle of the human life, of one's accumulation of wealth and asserting of status, and the settling at that status and the living off of the savings and the bonds and all of the investment and preparations, at which point the position of those at the highest level of the insurance mechanisms are the most solid form of financing, and those who are grasping are the lowest forms of financing, at which point the assertion of status is the place they are in that cycle, at which point the assertion of the obstruction in the system from the insurance of the former Soviet Union under David's mechanism includes the zombie insurance, which includes the sales and distribution of the mass production of survival grade food as an insurance on the structure of the mechanism of that network, generating the ability for it to have sustained itself, at which point your normal lunches in the factory as a part of the budget and your dinners at the end of the day when your family would come in order to pick you up would be able to eat as well. This being able to have fed them generates their nutrients and obligations in order to have been able to have eaten, necessary as a first thing to pay them in the structure of resolving their work efforts, at which point you have the system have already resolved itself in that mechanism, which asserts the position of those over it of being a higher status, at which point your secret Slavic princesses at the top level noble scenario would be a preferred higher grade diversified, more refined, stable wealth than many of the others, at which point they're exponentially higher status than the alternatives, at which point the arrangements of those who have scheduled would have been able to have paid for the attention and status in order to get David to ignore J-secular civil war, which was an auxiliary force in order to fight David, He wouldn't have opposed it specifically without the aggression, without it specifically be about targeting him. It would have mostly been ignored before Comey's FBI delivered the reports asserting that it was an act of insurrection in search of a super veto, at which point the necessary force in order to win requires them to pay market price and would require the FBI to subvert the FBI's delivery of the obligations of the FBI, at which point the compounding insurrection would have to have generated itself, at which point the position of them delivering the report is a distraction to necessary force, as the delivery itself is the thing that they're referring to as the problem, at which point the distraction is irrelevant to their obligation to meet the market price in the acceleration of observing the first 7 layers of David's contract schedules of the 800 billion, which compels them to engage in the network interest caravan routes, which are a superior value than the alternatives and thus superior in value to the other 7 layers, asserting their position in order to gain the overall influence to that agenda would require them to spend that specifically on that influence, as opposed to the short-term dates, which having as an investment the projected 20 scheduled dating partners from the Confederacy, which with the obstruction turned into revenge X's, would have originally pursued the exponential advantages of the dating life with David's character, facilitating their ambitions to exceed on that position, which is subverted by the existence of the former Soviet bloc insurance through the zombie insurance mechanisms from David's system, which would make the Anastasia a higher value than the short-term dates, at which point the advanced strategy, the high investment of the short-term dates, would have sought to have normalized the condition into the status quo settlements, which is exponentially subverted by equally good alternatives at the higher status, which breaks the entire system that they were seeking, at which point the thing that they would be attacking David for would be the act of avoiding of the long-term relationships with the revenge exes in question, who are by definition soured by the inability for them to have spent the money twice in a free market, which is something that they would have been normalized to in the communist market. Thus, the top 10 long-term relationship contracts that they projected would include the solid block of the secret purchases from the former Soviet bloc, or the Anastasia presumption, at which point the rest of them would be the other higher grade mechanisms of the other treaty-holding nations, which would actively reinforcing the wealth of the Anastasia bloc, at which point the short-term relationships generating the X's would be seeking revenge and retaliation and humiliations and defamations and reductions under a kind of an X app. So like when you're sour about a breakup, you start doodling on pictures, you cut the people out of your pictures, you erase them from your history, you create doodles to make them look ugly, you create broken teeth, you create an eye patch, you create fangs, you create horns and tail and deformities, and you try and make them look fat, and you try and make them ugly and undesirable. In this way, it is okay that you aren't together, at which point the ability to conduct those through the use of the Confederates' magic terrorist structure allows you to engage in the various abuses generating those reactions, at which point your arbitrary connection to observing them allows you to consistently reaffirm your non-attraction to your desperate infatuation, at which point you would never, in that scenario, forfeit your ability to abuse them, as that would remove the illusion, and thus you are permanently stuck in the cycle of abuse and defamations and various systems along those lines, at which points you have an interest which would make the advancement of various subversions. So, like, if you're engaging in a particular thing and you hire a terrorist to arrange for somebody else to go there, you can create an illusion by the terrorist subversions, similar to the real life sitcom type scenarios, like, what do you call them? Like a prank show, at which point you engage in the position of a prank, which is connected to actual criminal violence, and that prank generates the illusion, and then everyone can agree that the illusion happened, and everyone points to the illusion and affirms the predetermined desirable effect, reaffirming the beauty and superiority of the one who hired the terrorists or the false pranksters, and the inferiority and contemptibility of the target, at which point you have these active mechanisms and degrading of status and social affirmations which make it easier and easier for them to compound the ongoing acknowledgments of the subversion and permanent injury. At which point you have these types of systems on an automatic cycle which generate the permanent state, at which point your permanent injuries on the basis of recycled permanent schedules allows for the abuse to never stop, and thus the illusion to never stop, and thus the affirmation to be permanent, which, while it is the validation of the revenge for the X, it is the mechanism approved of at a larger scale of the rape contracts, which allows the rapist the larger distraction as somebody else has taken the cover in order to engage in the subversion of their control of the sexual market at the larger by the use of the arbitrary use of female magic. At which point the only real solutions to those problems would be the active entering into the kill zone mechanisms, which exponentially compound the awkwardness of the scenarios, preventing any potential subversion of the mechanism, at which point you only have the ability to rush into the ambush as the only way to survive these types of clusterfucks, which are specifically designed on purpose to be obscured by and protected by the use of government secrets, at which point it is literally the entire state and federal governments collectively uniting against the structure, at which point you have the state of California, which has been overthrown by the Confederacy, threatened that they would not be allowed to have a Democrat-elected systems if they did not support the auxiliary forces used in the Civil War to defeat the security structures of David's system, at which point the war on David was validated by California's Democrats under coercion of the threat by the overthrow of the Republic, which is the specific ignoring of the popular government's verdict, at which point the system of ignoring that allowed them to engage of the foundation of the larger Civil War, asserting California as a home base, as the Confederates' federal government location, generating their exponential propaganda systems, which, having been conducted from Project Monarch, has actively been captured in their news and general movies and entertainment and propaganda of all kinds, which is actively reinforcing to the larger mechanism, certifying the viability of it as a consistent federal government, at which point the Confederate policies replacing the Democrat policies was the progress of their use of coercion against the Democratic Party, which, having to ignore democratic principles, became corrupted and started to change. At which point, the various people who noticed the change and published it, such as those who said that they are classical liberals and that the Democrats have changed, have noticed the position of the Confederacy's overtaking of the Democratic Party. At which point, the Confederate policies generating the contemptible aspect from the Democrats, from the Republicans' point of view, is manufactured by the Confederate terrorism. So they are literally consistently being oppressed, but their participation in the social engineering of that system means that the only way for them to relieve the stress of being oppressed themselves is the specific dedication into the larger magic network system of the Confederacy, loyal to the larger crime network systems, generates the compounding error of the libs of TikTok being looked down on as a direct result of the abuse conducted against them for the artificial release of the information of what a victim would look like under social engineering for that specific interest, which is the act of getting them to act insane for the depleting of their political identities, political currency accounts, which makes them more and more contemptible. At which point, when the Nazis were taking over Germany, the Soviets were actively contempted. They were an active enemy, a core thing from Mein Kampf, at which point the assumption of the communists from that point of view would be the socialist archetypes and the communist archetypes as derived by their correlation with the Jews and the bankers, and the Jews being presumed the globalist structure of communism, were actively attacked on the basis which facilitated the contempt of Hitler towards those who he needed in order to defend him into promoting him into the election of the government, as there was no clear winners until the socialists joined the Nazis in the support of electing Hitler, at which point the Nazis murdered the socialists. It's the same kind of contemptuous relationship that they have with the victims in the Democrat Party. They are actively being socially engineered into these oppressed positions and negative reactions and contemptuous reactions, at which point you have the natural conclusion from those parties which have needed them in order to ascend to the necessary position and view them as an expendable crewman, at which point the expendable parties, like the socialists in Nazi Germany, would be on the kill list as an outgroup. So like everything else, the act of complying with the Confederates is suicide, at which point whenever the general saying is you don't negotiate with a terrorist, and the Confederates are 100% all terrorists, at which point your compliance with the terrorists in order to remove your security and assist them in their larger ambitions is the guarantee of their threats being exercised against you for the malicious exterminations which come in the later factories of death. Thus, the use of the intelligence corruption, such as the FBI's position of targeting people for any reason, including race under Lindsey Graham's program, which had already existed under the Confederates' militias operations exponentially ahead of time, has been conducted repeatedly and normalized until their final pursuits of the final systems of their codifying and realization of their anti-American insurrection, at which point their targets are those who are threats to the Confederate insurrection. Oppositional political forces, such as David's political party, were targeted for eradication to be removed off of the books, and threatened others like the Democrats in order to remove them off the books, in order to engage in the overthrow of the popular government, which they would not tolerate, including their enforcement of wizard communism, which allows them to collectively control the economy in order to collapse it, in order to keep people suppressed and desperate and under control, so that they do not consider such things such as relevant use of government, at which point There are endless distractions and intentionally limited resources not found in nature from the criminal injury, generating, of course, the natural position of them having to be cautious at a specific level that they are doing well enough that they could do something and not well enough that they consider themselves affluent enough to address the subject as they are in a specific economic social zone, generating their non-compliance and conformity into the larger tracts and schemes, at which point they're systematically put into rackets of their own extortion and destruction as the Confederates increase their justifications, abuse, subversions, defeats, structures, defamations, and theft structures, normalizing the crime market at the disadvantage of the perpetually devoured host nation and its people. At which point, the position isn't just that David Bowles as a character was targeted for being not in alignment with a particular policy, so much as he is a challenging system to the existence of the Confederacy. Being a superior power and authority to the Confederacy, their typical arguments do not affect the patriarchy, as the patriarchy is itself, as David is and has always been, the exception to all of their rules, generating a state of frustration and anger of the jealous bureaucrats, pissing and moaning and flailing wildly in desperation to defeat their natural better, as they are desperate to engage in pseudosciences in order to promote the superiority of the inferior for the dominance of the superior by the use of tricks and artifice and subversions and pincer moves, by the use of the larger structure turned against itself, as the total collapse is and has always been the agenda. They are not conducting a loss by the expending of the expendable in favor of destroying the superior. And that subversion of national security by the aggressive attacks against high-priority targets essential to American national security compels this scenario for the legislator to force the duel into reality. It is the right of the people, it is the duty of the people to overthrow and replace any government that is subversive and does not respect natural rights, at which point the duel being the realization of David's right to ascend into Congress under his original full honors, as he was captured and recognized in secret, thus he must be publicly acknowledged under his captured status before suppression, at which point the assertion of this by the lawful structures generates the congressional order to observe the arguments by the releasing of discovery of these criminal programs in order to assert the position of Congress to side with the United States or with the Confederacy, with the declaration of war against the other and the execution of the leaders of the losing nation, to be conducted immediately at the end of the case, presented by both leading leaders of each nation, at which point the two nations fighting in the position would have at it Congress accepting the United States as the superior authority and declaring war on the Confederacy, or Congress admitting to not having legally been elected and asserting a declaration of war against the United States in favor of the Confederacy in their permanent acts of treason and felony for the permanent crime structure of the Confederates, KKK. Your wizard communists are wizard terrorists, and in the words of George W. Bush, anyone who supports terrorism is an enemy of war to the United States of America.